Hey Gooners and Goonettes. You probably already heard about the concept of space in 100 other videos and guides, as it's a pretty important fundamental, even in games that are outside of hero shooters. But I encourage you to brush up a bit more on the fundamentals, even if you are already playing at a higher level. There may be some small nuances that you might be forgetting to keep in mind. So, what is space? On paper, it's pretty simple. It's just areas of the map where your character can play in. Literally almost anywhere. The basics of space can be split into two categories: contested space and uncontested space. The concept of contested space simply means space that another character is consistently applying pressure onto. Whether it be with CC or damage, if you walk into that contested space, you're likely gonna get punished for it. Open space, on the other hand, essentially means anywhere that you can walk safely and you don't have to worry about much. The key thing to learn when it comes to space is knowing how space is made, and to do that, the first step is understand how space is contested. Essentially, space is contested in a character's threat range, not to be confused with a character's range, because while a rocket could shoot you from across the map, I don't think he is in any way a threat. Threat range can be summed up as anything a character has to stop an enemy from being there without dying. These characters can be grouped in four broad categories that exert threat in similar-ish ways. Tanks, for example, tend to have very high damage and utility up close, but it falls off a cliff when it reaches around mid-range. Using Thor as an example here, you can essentially imagine a circle around him that's the range of his dashes and enhanced form. Thor's damage output is very high, so anything that's in his circle here is going to be under very heavy pressure. On the other side of the spectrum, we have DPS characters. These characters tend to follow two categories: high mobility flanks that contest space in a similar range to tanks, and longer ranged characters that are a bit more fragile than their close range counterparts. Hela, for example, has good damage output across varying ranges despite a bit of damage drop-off. So anything Hela has in her line of sight will be contested heavily by her. And Black Panther, on the other hand, his threat range is around the range of his dashes. So if he is mid to far range from you, he is not much of a threat at all. Moving on to supports, they tend not to be very threatening by themselves, but are very powerful reinforcers of space through heals and other utility. For example, Invis Woman's effective threat range is only about 40 meters, and her damage output is rather middling, but if you put her on high ground with the Hela, it will make the Hela that much harder to be contested. If you start applying this concept to your games or other high elo games, you're gonna start noticing patterns. Here's an example of what a defensive position would look like. Notice that every character's threat range is overlapped onto the main choke point. This is important because it makes it that much harder for an enemy to walk through it without expending a massive amount of resources. Positions may vary and will change depending on where the enemies push from, but the concept of overlapping contested space will always remain the same. Every character's ability to contest space is dependent on the resources they have at the time, though it is more notable in supports, using Invis as an example here. When she has her ult up, she can reinforce an area very heavily for the 8 seconds that it's up. She can pretty much push into anything that won't one-shot her. As you all may know, support ults are very powerful in this game. Keep in mind, this concept is true for every character. It is just more noticeable in the popular supports, as they make your team nearly unkillable aside from a few combos and ultimates. Using Star-Lord as another example here, normally his threat range is very low due to his massive damage drop-off. But as soon as he gets ults, his threat range turns into something like Hela's, where if you're in his line of sight, you can probably die in half a second. Now we get to probably the most important thing to learn about space, and that is understanding how it is made and taken from other characters contesting it. Ways of taking space can be split into two categories, as mentioned earlier. Directly taking space will always lead to space being taken, whereas indirectly will open opportunities for your team to do so. Let's start with directly taking space. To directly take space, you have to remove the ability of the enemy that is contesting it to remain there. For example, if there was a Hela on high ground here holding this point, in order to relieve pressure for your team, you have to stop her from doing damage to this area she is contesting. There are typically two ways to go about this. The most efficient way, depending on your character, is to move your contested space into hers. Let's say you're playing someone like Thor here. Your threat range is relatively small, but you win the matchup if she is in your range. However, from this position, Hela is under 0 threats. The best way to force Hela out of this position is by charging up a dash behind cover and getting in her face. Now that Hela is in close proximity, she no longer wins the matchup, and she is forced to disengage with her Crow out of Thor's range. As you can see, her new threat range will give Thor's team significantly more space to play around. The second way to do this is by blocking the Hela's damage in some way. The main ways to do this is with shields, walls, or even body blocking. Same scenario, Hela is contesting all the space on high ground. Everything in her LOS is going to be under threats. But now let's take Magneto here and put him in this choke points. All of a sudden, it's going to be much more difficult to shoot anything behind Magneto or his wall when it is up. And the area that Hela contests is now much smaller. Moving on to indirectly taking space, this method works by moving the enemy's attention from the choke, or your other teammates, and onto you. This method mainly applies to flankers and dive tanks when they apply pressure, and forcing either their supports or DPS to look away from the main fight. The first way to do this is by making an aggressive play into space that the enemies want to hold. Let's look at this example here. The Bucky is outranged by Hela and cannot safely approach to contest her, especially with Dagger reinforcing the space with heals. But if we take Venom here and have him dive into the enemy Dagger, the Hela is going to have to make a choice. Either she is going to keep holding her LOS and contest space on points, or she turns and peels off the Venom. She probably doesn't want her support to die, so she's more likely than not going to churn and peel, having her LOS move away and indirectly frees up space for Bucky to move up. The second most common way you see indirect space being made is having a flanker harass the enemy backline from an off angle, forcing the enemies to expend resources to deal with the flanker or offset the damage that he's doing. With all those points covered, let's put all that together and identify goals and jobs for each role. Tanks and flankers should focus on freeing up as much space for your team as possible while staying alive, utilizing their utility and smaller but often more lethal threat range, either directly or indirectly. Ranged DPS should actively try to contest as much space as possible while remaining out of as much lethal enemy threat range as they can, as they are much more fragile than tanks. Supports should always look to reinforce as many teammates as possible while staying clear of enemy threat range. You can't heal your team if you're dead. Your life is arguably the most important one. With all that being said, if you start applying these concepts and thought processes in your own games, I am confident your game sense will improve drastically, reducing your deaths and improving your ability to anticipate your opponent's moves and decisions. That's gonna be all for part 1. The next video, which will be out soon, will cover the more advanced details of taking space and other factors that may play part in it. See you then.